Hello class, my name is Yvonne Reyes. I have selected option 4 and therefore will be comparing several works within Unit 2 and providing explanations for how they connect and differ. In this presentation, I will be comparing and contrasting the three literary works, Claude McKay's America, John Toomer's Reapers, and Zora Neale Hurston's How It Feels to Be Color to Me. Okay, so starting off with the poem America by Claude McKay, this poem is a depiction of McKay's love-hate feelings towards his country, and what exactly he feels fuels either notion. Though he immediately begins his poem by describing this country's mistreatment of him, he quickly shifts gears and confesses his love for her, as the poem begins with, "Although she feeds me bread of bitterness, and sinks into my throat her tiger's tooth, stealing my breath of life, I will confess, I love this cultured hell that tests my youth." In his personification of America, McKay shares the multiple ways she hurts him, feeding him bitter bread, a metaphor for the constant bitter resentment imposed upon him, and his own bitterness in reaction to the common mistreatment he endures. Not to mention the way she steals his breath of life, which is also a metaphor for the way he feels as though the United States is ultimately attempting to hinder or completely end his life. Alongside this, McKay provides a quick description of her appearance, comparing her to a tiger. This small detail of comparing the United States to a tiger, with teeth so sharp they effortlessly sink into his throat, is used to reflect this country's aggressive and violent nature towards Black Americans. The lines that follow highlight the good or what the author loves about this country. The author claims to feel very fond of the cultured hell that is American culture. This line could be interpreted in multiple ways, as simultaneously confessing his love for the Black culture of Harlem and emphasizing the way racism and prejudice is embedded within American culture, resulting in the phrase cultured hell. Though he initially argued that America makes him feel bitter, unsafe, and undesired, the vigor, as he states in line 5, that she ignites in him provides him with the strength to continuously endure the pain and hatred that comes with residing within her borders. He closes the poem with sharing, "Darkly I gaze into the days ahead, and see her might and granite wonders there, beneath the touch of time's unerring hand, like priceless treasures sinking in the sand," meaning that aside from his personal experience and relationship with this country, the power it withholds, fueled from its ego, bigotry, and hatred, will ultimately lead this country to its impending downfall. Who is Claude McKay, and what is his significance? Well, Claude McKay was originally from Jamaica, born in 1889, but then migrated to the United States in 1912 to study agriculture at Tuckegee University. Growing up in Jamaica, McKay grew up surrounded by many individuals of his same race, resulting in a great sense of racial pride that can clearly be seen in most of his literary works, including his poem America. His perception of race shifted, though, when he dropped out of university and moved to New York City, where he experienced firsthand the deep-rooted racism embedded within this country. After this, his writings to come were heavily inspired by his home country, resulting in his rise to fame during the Harlem Renaissance. This newly found fame granted him a platform that he used to further express his pride in being a Black American and to emphasize the movement against racism in the United States. The poem America is one of many poems written and released in his ensemble of poems, Harlem Shadows. His purpose for writing this poem was to provide his community in Harlem and throughout the United States a voice that could express both everything wrong with living in what McKay described as a cultured hell, while also encapsulating the optimistic spirit of the Black citizens of Harlem, New York, and throughout this country. Moving on, the poem Reapers by John Toomer deals with themes of oppression and death in its short work in regards to the social and economic realities of African Americans in the United States, filled with metaphors and other literary devices all throughout it. The villains in the poem who we are immediately introduced to are these reapers, which are described as machine-like beings that represent the desensitized state of African American slaves, as they are accustomed to the torment inflicted upon them and their community, as shown when the initial lines read, "Black reapers with the sound of steel on stones are sharpening scythes. I see them place the hones." One of the many metaphors in this poem that portrays one way in which Black Americans are oppressed is shown in line 6, when the author writes, "Black horses drive a mower through the weeds." The notion behind the term black in the poem is used as a guide in order to help the reader comprehend when the poem is indirectly referencing the Black community. The term black horses is used to compare the animal-like treatment or their existential reduction of being equal to that of an animal. The imagery of death in this poem illustrates the intolerable discarding of the lives of African Americans as a result of the violence fueled from racial tensions and hatred as depicted in lines, "And there a field rat startled, squealing, bleeds. His belly close to ground. I see the blade, blood-stained, continue cutting weeds in shade." In regards to the metaphorical imagery of oppression, all in all, John Toomer's Reaper speaks upon the senseless violence and mistreatment of Black Americans. So who was John Toomer? According to the article John Toomer as a Poet, a Phenomenology of the Spirit by Robert Jones, so much about Toomer's life as an artist and philosopher is revealed through his poetry. His poem Reapers came about during one of his four distinct eras of poetry, the aesthetic period, which reigned from 1919 to August of 1921, and consisted of imagism, improv, and literary experimentation. This poem is set in the South during times of slavery and was originally released in his novel Cain, a novel of which was compiled of stories and poems that shed light on the African American experience, released during the Harlem Renaissance. Because he was brought up in Chicago and Washington, D.C., Toomer was provided with the opportunity of experiencing two very distinct types of societal constructs within these two cities. Eventually moving to Georgia during his career in teaching, he got to experience firsthand a rural small town in which predominantly African Americans resided. His time here flipped a switch within him, and after living through various different regions in which he witnessed and experienced the differences of being Black in each of them, he ultimately became successful in his writing career. His intentions in writing this poem were to shed light on the discrimination faced by the Black community in a captivating and powerful way through his usage of imagism and literary language. How It Feels to Be Colored Me by Zora Neale Hurston details her experiences growing up Black and of being perceived as different from the white community. In this text, Hurston states that instead of feeling outcasted or unwanted, she actually felt the opposite and appreciated the attention she received about her differing complexion and culture from the white community. The text reads, "But I am not tragically colored. There is no great sorrow dammed up in my soul, nor lurking behind my eyes. I do not mind at all." This notion does take a small shift when eventually in the text she goes on to state, "I have no separate feeling about being an American citizen and colored. I am merely a fragment of the great soul that surges within the boundaries. My country, right or wrong, sometimes I feel discriminated against, but it merely astonishes me. How can any deny themselves the pleasure of my company?" Though she does not allow herself to feel the sorrow of discrimination, she does acknowledge that her experience is discriminatory, but still refuses to be hurt or hindered by it. Instead, Hurston is the embodiment of strength and assertiveness towards the hatred and prejudice that she experiences for simply existing as a Black woman in America. Who was Zora Neale Hurston? Zora Neale Hurston was born in Alabama, but moved to a small town with an all-Black community in Edenville, Florida. Her first time experiencing racism came about when she was sent to a boarding school in Jacksonville, Florida. Her memoir, How It Feels to Be Colored Me, was written regarding this experience and how she managed to overcome the racially motivated adversity she encountered at her school and throughout her life. Her purpose in writing this memoir was to instill hope and inspire other members of her community to persevere as she did and to continue living with a positive outlook regardless of the harm others wished to inflict upon them. Now that I have summarized and analyzed these three separate texts and have provided some background information regarding the authors to better comprehend the thematic message within each piece, I will now highlight the ways they compare to and contrast one another. Beginning with how these texts differentiate from one another, since I found there were not many obvious differences, one way in which these three texts differentiate is through their settings, specifically the time frame or era in which they are based upon. Unlike Mackay and Hurston's works, John Toomer's Reapers was not written with the intention of being based upon their current or present-day experience. Based on the lines, "Black horses drive a mower through the weeds, and there a field rat startled squealing bleeds," the imagery that is brought to mind is a vast piece of land, a land of which needs to be harvested, and though a field rat gets harmed in the process, the reapers continue on mowing. As I have previously stated, the robotic, unfeeling reapers represent the slaves, and this imagery is a reflection of how, regardless of the horrors and abuse they witnessed and being endured by their fellow slaves, they had to continue forward with their work. Though it could be interpreted to be based on the time in which it was written, upon my research and according to the article, John Toomer as a Poet, a Phenomenology of the Spirit, I found that John Toomer's Reapers was written with the intention of being about slavery. I feel as though he understood that, like many literary works, his poem could be up for interpretation, for regardless of the setting or era this poem takes place in, the thematic message is the same. And truly ashamed that over 60 years since the abolishment of slavery, that his poem still resonated with African Americans in the 1920s when it was published, and more so that even almost 100 years after its release, does it still instill those same sentiments in the Black community today. as it did all those years ago. I felt as though this was primarily one of the only differences that really stood out to me, as I believed that these three texts shared more similarities than differences. Moving on to the similarities. A similarity amongst these texts is noted in America by Claude McKay and Reapers by John Toomer. Though nowhere in either text is the race of the author specifically mentioned, when describing the violence and hatred he faces in McKay's America, it is undeniable that he is a minority in this country. According to the U.S. Department of Justice, the Bureau of Justice Statistics confirms that the racial group that faces the most violence in the form of hate crimes and discrimination are in fact Black Americans. This first chart, Table 1, shows that most hate crimes in the United States as of last year were caused on the premise of race, ethnicity, and ancestry, being almost 60% of all hate crimes. In the chart that follows, Table 2, of those 60%, 48.6% of victims were Black Americans. These statistics confirm that without even knowing the author's race and ethnicity, McKay's America is obviously speaking out about his experience as a Black person in the United States. This notion also applies to the poem Reapers by John Toomer. As I had previously stated in my analysis of his poem, there are many context clues that allure to the notion that this poem is not simply about reapers wreaking havoc in a field, harvesting goods and destroying whatever lies in their path, but a metaphor for a seemingly more powerful being oppressing, exploiting, and even physically harming a being who is deemed powerless in their situation, for example, the mouse who gets slaughtered. Because of the era in which it was written, and based on his other works that speak out against racial injustices targeting his community, the connection between this poem and the revolutionary time in which it was published makes said connection translucent. Continuing on with similarities. The themes in Hurston's How It Feels to Be Colored Me and McKay's America overlap and are similar in the way that both narrators within their texts challenge the discrimination and prejudices they undergo. Because both Hurston and McKay shared similar upbringings, growing up surrounded by mostly members of their own race, unbeknownst to the hatred the rest of the world seems to harbor for them, these two texts highly reflect one another. Instead of succumbing to the negativity and hatred, they continuously persevere and are stronger because of it. Hurston even makes light of her situation throughout her text, sharing the sentiment when she states, "The game of keeping what one has is never so exciting as the game of getting." And when she also states, "Slavery is 60 years in the past. The operation was successful, and the patient is doing well. Thank you." Her ability of brushing off the devastating harshness of the reality of her situation is truly remarkable, and once again radiates the same notion as McKay's America when he states, "Her vigor flows like tides into my blood, giving me strength erect against her hate," as he too uses the hatred he receives to harbor a strength that motivates him to continue on. This brings me to my next point, that they all correlate through their releases during the Harlem Renaissance. The Harlem Renaissance, according to the article, The Harlem Renaissance in Black and White, by George Hutchinson, was an era in which the African American community erupted with new culturally responsive music, art, and literary pieces that fueled from their cultural nationalism, of which aided in the flourishing of the new Negro movement, and instilled a renewed or newly found pride within their community. All three of these texts are products of the Harlem Renaissance, and each of these pieces and authors are considered both highly influential figures and important pieces of text to come out of it. All in all, though these three texts varied in very few ways, they are more similar in regards to the issues they are speaking upon, which were the injustices and discrimination of Black people in America, their overall thematic messages within each individual piece, and their release or publishing during the Harlem Renaissance. Well, thank you for listening to my presentation. I hope it comes in service to some of you, and I wish you guys luck on Essay 2. Thank you.